good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kutin.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider the news of the day. We kick off the show tonight with a shout out to our Harimau Melaya squad, currently battling Indonesia in the 2022 World Cup qualifiers in Bukit Jalil. I guess that seems to be one eye. Most people will have one eye on the match, and then the other. While you're watching that, let's catch you up to date with what's happening today in the political scene. We've got political rumour mills turning on news of a meeting between PKR Deputy President Azmin Ali as well as UMNO lawmakers. Sharaad, what did you make of this?
Yeah, it seems like politicians, perhaps they exist on a very different planet from the rest of us, and they continue to do what many Malaysians have come to despise about the political class, which is their constant politicking, right? The intrigues, the maneuvers against each other, and dragging the country into endless discussions that perhaps do not go to the heart of many of the concerns of individual Malaysians, which have to do with the quality of education, the possibility of getting a decent job, whether this government is prepared for some of the global economic, headwinds that are said to be there, including a possible recession in the major economies. All these really important questions not being addressed by even those tasked with the economic affairs of the country.
Definitely, and I think that Azmin's job really is to take care of the economy as promised by the Pakatan Harapan manifesto. However, what's interesting, just monitoring the news of the day that's come out from news that there had been a meeting between Azmin Ali and some UMNO politicians, has been the fact that most people are divided on whether it is in the interest of the public to know what happened in this meeting. So we had Bersatu strategist Rais Hussein, who was on the show last night, talking about how this meeting could further erode public confidence in the Pakatan Harapan coalition. So he's saying, well, the public needs to know what transpired in that meeting. Versus what Azmin is saying. Azmin says, listen, it was just, a regular meeting. Anyone who wants to meet him can meet him, so he doesn't feel the need to justify.
Yeah, but because it was an extraordinary moment, and you had the media camped out outside his residence, looking at the cars, looking at who was coming in, who was leaving. My MP, Maria Chin Abdullah from Petaling Jaya, also in the media today, saying there was nothing amiss about this meeting and it was purely a discussion about economic affairs. But the question is, if it was such a large group of MPs, why were some invited, why were others not invited, why wasn't this done during office hours?
So we've agreed that really, the discussion should be, the focus should be on the economy and I guess managing the issues that the Malaysian economy is facing. However, Sharaad, in the political landscape, do you think we're ripe for some political realignments?
Well, this is a thing that Dr. Mahathir has also recently weighed in on. He says he doesn't think Malaysia is ready for a transformation, or a succession issue again has reared its ugly head, and which is the question of whether Dr. Mahathir is going to step down in favour of Anwar Ibrahim as promised before the general election. Now that is still said to be up in the air, or there's some sort of compact. Nobody seems to really know. But what I think is really important, Melissa, at this point in time, again, is constant reminders to the government of the day to be on message, to focus on what people actually are concerned about. The Tanjung Piai by-election seemed, and the absolute rout that Pakatan Harapan suffered, seems to have not made a dent in the comportment of
business as usual,
right?
The
comportment of the Pakatan Harapan government. I mean, they seem to think that it's something that they will, do some analysis about and move on from there. I mean.
All right, well, let's focus on the other big news of the day. The criminal trial against UMNO President Ahmad Zahid Hamidi, who is accused of embezzling 31 million ringgit from Yayasan Akal Budi, which he founded. Now, a witness told the court that Zahid Hamidi had ordered him to sign a blank cheque, or several blank cheques, in the name of Yayasan Akal Budi, and this without being informed of the purpose of those checks.
So we have this wonderful situation where, we are very critical about how the Pakatan Harapan government and its this current administration conducts itself. It's, we talked about, business as usual post Tanjung Piai, but there was, decades of Barisan Nasional business as usual, and perhaps this trial, As yet, Zaid is not convicted of the crime he's accused of. But what we will be viewing over the next couple of weeks is exactly the way in which politicians of the previous dispensation, the previous government, deal with government institutions or private institutions for their own profit. And that's the accusation that he has to face. And that was business as usual under Barisan Nasional.
No, my biggest concern, Sharaad, is the fact that the witness also told was also told the court that Yayasan Akal Budi was set up to protect Ahmad Zaid Amidi's interests. Now, my concern is the trust deficit that this brings out. You know, the lack of trust that people will say, oh well, if some foundations were allegedly misusing funds that I donated to help the poor, what then of other foundations? And I've recently read about Yayasan Chalkit, which is under pressure, financial pressure now, to make sure that they have enough funds to keep their programs going to help the underprivileged children of Chalkit. So whether this trust deficit will breed into something more and hurt existing foundations that are doing good work, genuine foundations that are doing good work. All right, coming up on the show, we're going to ask you to reconsider some of your assumptions about two very divisive issues: child marriage and the death penalty. Stay tuned to consider this. Welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here with you. Now, tomorrow is World Children's Day, which makes it all the more timely to discuss the issue of child marriage. Today, we heard in Parliament that 7 states have turned down the federal government's proposal to amend their state enactments to ban child marriages for Muslims. Now, Sarawak, Pahang, Terengganu, Perlis, Negeri Sembilan, Kedah and Kelantan have all refused to raise the minimum age for marriage for Muslims to 18. So to better understand this multifaceted issue of child marriage in Malaysia, we have on the line with us Sharmila Sekaran, chairperson for Children's Advocacy Group, Voice of the Children. Sharmila, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, I want to ask you, with this issue of child marriage, is it best addressed through legislation? I mean, can you essentially legislate away what has been a cultural practice?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Melissa. Hi, good evening. It's a really good question because a lot of people seem to think that the best solution is to legislate against child marriage. And when we talk about legislation, we need to consider whether we're talking about civil legislation or criminal legislation, whether we want to impose criminal sanctions. But that aside, a lot of countries have legislated, and yet child marriage still happens. It still takes place in a lot of these countries. Even in Malaysia, we have a law, the Law Reform Divorce and Marriage Act, which prohibits girls below the age of 16 from getting married. And yet we know, for non-Muslim girls, and yet we know that there are girls below the age of 16 getting married. So legislation alone will not solve this problem or address the issue. It really needs to have a bottom-up and top-down approach. So legislation goes only so far as to help people tell those around them, societies, that child marriage is bad and wrong and should not be allowed. But like you said, if it's a traditional practice, if it's a cultural practice, if there are reasons other than just wanting children to be married early, then we really need to look at those issues first before we talk about the legislation.
Sharmila, to what extent are these issues about the economy, the structure of the economy? Feudal societies, agricultural societies had their marriage patterns, industrialized societies as they transformed. Most advanced industrial societies, people are marrying very, very late. And that's because women are part of the workforce, women are going through school and so on and so forth. Is that the problem here? Some parts of the country really well advanced economically, so women are full participants both in education and the economy. In some parts of the country, very rural and so on and so forth, this is not the case, and it remains largely stuck in a particular era, and therefore we see these practices as kind of a residue of a former an economy now perhaps declining.
Absolutely. So there are various reasons as to why child marriages happen. For example, the indigenous communities, the Orang Asli and the Orang Asal, we actually see that their mortality rate in terms of lifespan is much shorter than those of us from the more urban areas, the more wealthy professional classes. So they are passing away at a much younger age, which means they need to start getting married much earlier, much as they did in the past, even within our own communities. Get married early, have their children early, because by the time you're 50, you're going to be expiring. So if you want to have that legacy of children and grandchildren, then you need to start a lot earlier. So there is that factor. There's also the factor that a lot of children, so child marriages are happening for a variety of reasons. Poverty is definitely one of the factors. As long as the children in a particular community are able to do certain things. So, for example, in Sarawak, as long as a boy is able to fend for a family, catch food for the family, hunt, and things like that, and provide, then he's old enough to get married. So these are some of the other considerations. Plus the fact that, a lot of children in Malaysia do not fully understand sexual reproductive health. They don't know what activities or behaviors could get them into trouble. And that's one of the other factors that we're seeing, especially in the urban areas, as to why there are high rates of child marriage, because a lot of these children are having sexual relations early, the girls are getting pregnant, teenage and early pregnancies, and the solution so that we don't lose face, so that, children are not born out of wedlock, is to get the girls married off early. So what we really need to do is look at all the drivers, and this is one of the factors, the sense of hopelessness. For some children, they feel that once they're married, then they become adults, in inverted commas, and that they're treated as adults, and they look like adults, looked upon as adults by their families, by their parents.
Right. Sharmila, so, just now you mentioned, you brought up the Orang Asli, Orang Asal communities. You talked about what's happening in Sabah Sarawak. And I think that's quite interesting because a common perception when it comes to child marriage is that this is an issue that's confined to a specific community, to a specific religion, to a specific race. Now, in actuality, child marriages occur in all communities across the board, all races, all religions as well. So talk to us a little bit about that. Also, it happens to both girls and boys, right?
Yes, absolutely. So Malaysia is quite unique in that sense because we do not have the kinds of figures that we're seeing in, for example, South Asia, where there are high rates of child brides, girls or girl brides. In Malaysia, we're actually seeing an almost equal number of boys and girls below the age of 18 getting married. You're having, we're also seeing incidences where the boys are younger than their brides, the wives they marry. And sometimes the girls are older than the boys are adults. The girls are like 20, 21, and the boys are 16 or 17. So they are, it's the reverse of what we presume. And also, if we look at it demographically, what we are also seeing is an almost equal number in terms of the number of people within a particular community. So whether it's the Indians, the Chinese, or the Malays and Orang Asli, an almost equal number of non-Malays getting married as well, or non-Muslims getting married as children.
Sharmila,
so Malaysia is quite unique like that.
Yeah, we've had some high-profile cases, and I wonder, where you have a much older man, someone in his 40s marrying a teenager, 12-year-old, 13-year-old, 14-year-old. Now, a lot of people scream pedophilia and pedophile when they see, read about these cases. Has that in some ways distorted our view of this? Is child marriage essentially about legitimizing pedophilia?
Oh, no. Yes, so there is that factor where, which we're seeing quite a lot of, but if you actually look at the number of child marriage cases, a lot of them are of more similar age, where the boys and girls are of similar age. There are very, very rare cases where it's a much older man and a much younger, a teenage girl. But, you know, pedophilia, we have to understand that pedophilia is actually, in a sense, it's an illness. You know, much like alcoholism or gambling, it's an illness. Just because an older person gets married or has sexual relations with a much younger, with a child, it doesn't necessarily mean it's pedophilia. It could just be, most of them are opportunists. So a pedophile is someone who's been diagnosed as a pedophile as an illness. Everyone else is an opportunist. What we're also seeing are cases where they need to legitimize a relationship. So really, it's a case of girls indulging in sexual relations much earlier, at a young age, not knowing and understanding what they're doing fully, because they're not being given the right kind of education, the full extent of education that they require in schools. They're engaging in sexual relations earlier, and as a response to that, so that we don't, you know, so that they're not loose girls, in inverted commas, they're being made to get married to these people that they're having sexual relations with. So what we really need to do...
we have a few minutes remaining. I just want to ask you about the question of political will. I mean, this government is getting a lot of sort of negative feedback about the progress of this whole issue. So we had the recent announcement of 7 states. Now, they're evenly divided. Pakatan Harapan has 2 states. 2 states are under PAS, 2 states are under UMNO, and one, of course, under, you know, the territory of Sarawak is there as well. So it seems like it's across the board. I mean, how do you read the politics of pushing through this legislation?
I think a lot more work needs to be done on the ground. The problem with legislation is that very often it will affect the people who do not have access to justice. So it's going to be the poorest who are going to be penalized. It's going to be the people who do not have the necessary awareness because of where the community is, you know, with very little access to broadcasters and media and advertisements and things like that. These are the people who are going to be hit first and foremost with any kind of legislation. What we really need to do, what I would really like to see, is for this government to have a moratorium on child marriage and to put themselves on a very strict timeline, whether it's 2 years or 5 years. I think 5 years is quite reasonable, to say we're going to go to the ground and we're going to educate people. Because when the information is given to people, a lot of people seem to think it's a Muslim-only issue. So there are a lot of non-Muslims who do not want to talk about this issue because they think it's, oh, you know, it's Muslims, let them sort it out. When the data that we do have, although it's very little and it's not, we need disaggregated data, the data that we do have shows that actually it's a little bit more evenly spread. So we really need to do a lot more work in terms of raising awareness and teaching communities why child marriages is not the way to go, and to hear from the children. Voice of the Children, we recently released a documentary on child marriage at the end of August, and the children we interviewed, completely unsolicited, the children we interviewed, all of them said, child marriage is bad, don't be like me. You know, they all came up with very similar phrases that they prefer, that they would have had a different life and not to have got married early.
Sharmila, thank you so much for speaking with us and sharing those insights and shedding some light into this issue. We're going to be back with more on Consider This. Make sure you stay tuned. Welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here with you this evening. Now, we're asking you once again to reconsider your assumptions about yet another very difficult, very divisive issue tonight, the death penalty. Abdul Halim is a Malaysian on death row in Singapore's Changi prison. 2 years ago, he had been sentenced to death for trafficking diamorphine. He was scheduled to be hanged at dawn on Friday. Now, joining us on the line right now to discuss the current case is N. Surendran, Advisor for Lawyers for Liberty. Surendran, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, you've represented Malaysians on death row, Malaysian death row inmates in Singapore previously. You have accused the Singapore government of double standards when it comes to targeting Malaysians charged with drug trafficking for execution. Can you give us an update, Surendran, of the current case?
Yes. Helmi is a Johorian. He's 36 years old. He's married with children. And the particularly unusual aspect of this case is that he was convicted for trafficking in only 16.56 grams of diamorphine, which has got a street name heroin. So that is, I've never come across a case in which someone is being is supposed to be hanged for an amount as low as 16 grams. The minimum is 15 grams. And of course, he has maintained throughout the trial that he did not know that he had been carrying prohibited drugs. And despite that, of course, he was convicted.
But so can you explain to us, I mean, does the law allow the Singaporean authorities to, convict him and sentence him to death for that amount? I mean, is it, are they going beyond the law in this regard, or you just think it's unusual because the amount is so close to the as it were, the minimum?
They've not gone beyond the letter of the law because 15 grams is the minimum, but there is a prosecutorial discretion not to charge when the amount is so small. Imagine hanging a man over 16 grams when we've seen tons of drugs being impounded or seized and nobody gets charged. And yet a low-level drug mule is going to be hanged for 16 grams. That's why we say that this case is unusual and it's quite shocking, really.
Can you give us a sense, Surendran, of a comparison between the narcotics laws in Singapore versus in Malaysia and the rest of the region?
Well, the narcotics law in Singapore, of course, are enforced are much stricter, but in many aspects it is quite similar to what we have in Malaysia. But of course, I think Malaysia has come to the realization that there's a problem in executing human beings for drug crimes where no element of violence is involved. And there's a moratorium that has been in place in Malaysia for quite some time. And the new government is committed to abolishing the death penalty for drug offences. But that's not the case. In Singapore, we see an escalation or an increase in cases, and many of them involve Malaysians. The largest number of drug offenders on death row in Malaysia, in Singapore and Changi prison, in Singapore's Changi prison, are Malaysians. So that's
did Helmi get a good
concern. Yeah.
Did Helmi get a fair trial?
We say he did not, for the very simple reason that the members of the government in Singapore, including the Home Minister, have gone on record many times making statements that clearly target Malaysians. Now, I don't want to disparage the judicial system of another country, but it is well known that no one seriously thinks that Singapore has got an independent judicial system. And where members of the government make statements like this, we worry whether our citizens could have got a fair trial. It seems unlikely. And let's not forget that the rate of conviction in Singapore for drug offences are extremely high, unusually high, and clearly a product of a judicial process that is not entirely independent.
Surendran, in the past, many attempts to campaign on behalf of convicted felons, Malaysians or otherwise, to avoid the death penalty, the appeals have been on the basis of clemency and, basic human dignity. These have fallen on deaf ears. I mean, is it in some ways counterproductive to mount a campaign to save people? I mean, is there another way to actually save somebody, perhaps less antagonistic or kind of frontal and confrontational?
Well, we've tried over the years. I think every method has been tried. Asking them nicely or pleading with them has unfortunately never worked. There have been many memorandums, petitions, everything has been tried. But unfortunately, Singapore has been stubborn about this, and whereas other countries are moving away from it, particularly here, home in Malaysia, we find our citizens have to face this kind of treatment abroad. And let's not forget that the UN has come out repeatedly and said that executing people for drug crimes amounts to unlawful killing. Malaysia's taken note of it, but Singapore is just not listening. That's our concern, and we don't see any other way except to strongly campaign against continued executions of drug offenders.
Surendran, is there any other? Is there a next course of action, another recourse for Helmi?
Well, it is certainly an uphill task because the execution is scheduled for Friday. In previous cases, we have managed to stop it, as in April in Panir Selvan's case. But as difficult as it may be and as uphill as it may be, we feel that we have to try and save every human life if we can. It's an absolute good to save a life, and it's an absolute evil to take it away.
Do you think you have the Malaysian public on your side in this regard? There are a lot of people who say that a convicted felon is a convicted felon, and they seem to have no sympathy for particularly people who are labeled under the drug charges.
Certainly, there are differing views and a split when it comes to the death penalty. But I think a lot of people sympathize, particularly when you're talking about low-level drug mules. A lot of people understand that the drug kingpins are laughing all the way to the bank when the poor drug mules who get paid a pittance for doing what they do get hanged. So I think we sense that there is a great deal of sympathy and understanding, particularly since our government is moving away from it. And previously, even our government ministers, even the Prime Minister in the case of Michael Garing, came out pleading for his life. There is a change in the attitude of Malaysians. We sense that.
Thank you so much for speaking with us this evening. That's
Thank
all the
you.
time we have on the show tonight. I'm Melisa Idris, with me, Sharaad Kutan. We will be back with you same time tomorrow night for another episode of Consider This. Thank you for watching and good night.